James Emerson walked with a confident stride through his small Alabama hometown. People nodded respectfully as he passed, some out of genuine admiration, others from fear. At 52 years old, his broad shoulders still carried the frame of the college football player he once was, though his brown hair had faded to gray at the temples. For 15 years, James had led the local chapter of the Ku Klux Klan. He was not just a member but a devoted leader who believed completely in the cause. On Saturday nights, he would stand before his followers in the traditional white robes, his voice booming across the gathering as he spoke about keeping their community pure. "My daddy raised me right," he often told new members, "and I'm raising my boy the same way." His home sat on 3 acres of land passed down through generations of Emersons. It was a simple 2-story house with a wide front porch where James often sat in the evenings, drinking sweet tea and watching the sunset. His wife, Linda, kept the house spotless and dinner warm on the table every night at 6 o'clock sharp. Their son, Matthew, was 17 now. He had his mother's gentle features and quiet nature. Unlike James, who filled any room with his presence, Matthew seemed to slip through life trying not to be noticed. He got good grades, played baseball because his father insisted, and never caused trouble. "That boy needs to toughen up," James would tell Linda when Matthew was out of earshot. "World's a hard place." James ran his auto repair shop in town, where local men gathered to talk politics and share stories. The walls of his office were covered with Confederate flags and photos of James at various KKK rallies. He took pride in being what he called a community protector. Every Thursday night, James held meetings at an old barn on the edge of town. Men arrived in pickup trucks, parking far apart, so no one could count exactly how many attended. Inside, they planned rallies, discussed problems in nearby towns, and recruited new members. Matthew never attended these meetings. James told everyone his son was focusing on school, that he joined them when he was ready. The truth was, whenever James brought up the topic, Matthew found some excuse to avoid it. One warm Friday evening in late spring, James organized a large rally on the outskirts of the neighboring county. Over 50 members showed up, carrying torches and signs with hateful messages. They marched toward a small community that had recently seen several black families move in. The police kept their distance, watching but not interfering. James stood at the front, leading chants and feeling powerful. But then something unexpected happened. As they rounded a corner, they came face to face with a black family heading home from dinner. Parents and 2 young children who couldn't be more than 6 or 7 years old. For a brief moment, James locked eyes with the youngest child. The pure fear he saw there made something inside him pause. The child's father quickly pulled the family aside, hurrying them away from the approaching crowd. James continued leading the march, but that look stayed with him. Later that night, as he drove home alone, James couldn't shake the image from his mind. He told himself it was nothing, that he was doing what was necessary to protect his way of life. By the time he pulled into his driveway, he had almost convinced himself. Inside, he found Linda asleep on the couch, waiting for him. Matthew's door was closed, a strip of light showing underneath. James considered knocking, talking to his son about the rally, bringing him into the fold properly. Instead, he walked past, suddenly tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. The morning after the rally, James woke up before sunrise. This was unusual for him on a Saturday. Normally, he slept in, enjoying his day off from the auto shop. But today, sleep had come in fitful bursts, interrupted by dreams he couldn't quite remember. Linda found him sitting at the kitchen table, staring at his untouched coffee. "Everything okay?" she asked, tying her robe around her waist. "Fine," James muttered, though his mind was still replaying the fear in that child's eyes from last night. Over the next few days, James noticed small changes in himself. At work, when Clyde Harmon came in talking about those people moving into the county, James nodded, but didn't join in like he usually did. At dinner, he was quieter, watching Matthew push food around his plate. "How's school?" James asked his son one evening. Matthew looked up, surprised by his father's interest. "It's okay. Got an A on my history paper." "Good," James said, wanting to say more but not knowing how. They hadn't had a real conversation in months. A week after the rally, James was working late at his shop when Sheriff Miller stopped by. The 2 men had known each other since high school. The sheriff never bothered James about his KKK activities, and James made sure his group stayed just within the law. Heard your rally got a bit close to the Turner family last Friday, Sheriff Miller said, leaning against a car James was fixing. We were just exercising our rights, James replied automatically. Sure, sure. Just saying maybe next time, keep a better eye on where families with kids might be. The sheriff gave him a meaningful look before leaving. That night, James dreamed of his own father. In the dream, they were burning a cross on someone's lawn while a family watched from the windows. But when James looked closer, he saw Matthew's face among the frightened people inside the house. He woke up with his heart pounding. At breakfast, James watched Matthew closely. The boy had his mother's gentle eyes and slim build. There was nothing of the toughness James had tried to instill in him over the years. Dad, you're staring, Matthew said, uncomfortable. Just thinking, James replied. You going out with friends today? Just studying at the library, Matthew said quickly, too quickly. Later that morning, James noticed Matthew waiting at the bus stop instead of taking his car. Curious, James decided to follow at a distance. The bus took Matthew not to the library in their town, but to the next county over. James followed, parking across from the community center where Matthew got off. He watched his son walk inside, greeting a young black man with a smile that James had rarely seen on his son's face. The easy way they bumped shoulders made something twist in James's stomach. For 3 hours, James sat in his truck, the air conditioning struggling against the spring heat. When Matthew finally emerged, he was with a group of teenagers, white, black, Hispanic, all laughing together about something. On the drive home, James's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. This wasn't how he had raised his son. This wasn't what an Emerson was supposed to be. That night, the KKK meeting seemed different to James. As he looked around at the angry faces of men reciting the same complaints they had for years, he found himself wondering what they would say if they knew his son was spending time with the very people they hated. We need to plan something bigger, Earl Stevens was saying. Show them we mean business. In the past, James would have been the first to agree. Instead, he heard himself say, maybe we should think this through more carefully. The room fell silent. No one was used to James Emerson suggesting caution. That night, after everyone left, James sat alone in the barn. The crack that had started with a child's frightened eyes was growing wider. For the first time in his adult life, James Emerson wasn't sure about who he was or what he believed. James couldn't sleep that night. The image of Matthew smiling with those kids kept playing in his mind. By morning, he had made a decision. If his son was hiding something, he needed to know what it was. After breakfast, James waited until Matthew left for school. Then he did something he had never done before. He went into his son's bedroom and began looking around. The room was neat, almost too neat, as if Matthew didn't want to leave anything out that might cause trouble. James checked under the bed, in the closet, and in the desk drawers. Nothing seemed unusual. He was about to leave when he noticed a loose floorboard near the window. James pried it up and found a small box. Inside were things Matthew had hidden: a journal, some pamphlets, and a rainbow-colored bracelet. James's hands trembled as he opened the journal and began to read. Dad would kill me if he knew, one entry began. The meetings are the only place I can be myself. Jake says I should tell them the truth, but he doesn't understand what my family is like, what my father is like. James felt cold all over. He flipped through the pamphlets. They were from something called the Rainbow Youth Center in the next county, the same building he had seen Matthew enter. For the next week, James watched his son closely. He noticed things he had missed before: how Matthew never talked about girls, how he changed the subject when James's friends made certain jokes, how he flinched when James went on his usual rants about those people ruining their town. On Thursday, instead of going to the KKK meeting, James told everyone he was sick. After Matthew said he was going to study at a friend's house, James followed him again. This time, Matthew went to a small coffee shop. Through the window, James watched his son meet a young man. They sat close together, talking with their heads bent toward each other. When the other boy reached out and briefly touched Matthew's hand, James' world shifted beneath his feet. Back home, Linda noticed something was wrong. You've been acting strange for weeks now, she said as they got ready for bed. Is it something at work? No, James said. Just thinking about some things. Is it Matthew? I've noticed you watching him. James couldn't bring himself to tell her what he had discovered. I'm just worried about him. He seems different lately. The next day, James called in sick to work again. He went to the public library in the next town over, where nobody would recognize him. He asked the librarian for information about the Rainbow Youth Center, pretending it was for a church outreach program. "Oh, they do wonderful work," the older woman said brightly. "Support for LGBTQ teenagers. Such a needed service in these parts. So many kids get thrown out when their parents find out." James thanked her and found a quiet corner to read the materials she had given him. Words jumped out at him: gay, acceptance, suicide rates, family rejection. His hands shook as he read about children who had taken their own lives after being rejected by their families. Was this what Matthew feared? That James would throw him out? Or worse? That evening, James sat on the porch, watching the sunset. His entire life, he had believed certain things without question. Now, those beliefs were crashing against the love he felt for his son. Inside, he could hear Matthew and Linda laughing about something. The sound made his chest hurt. How long had it been since he had laughed with his son? James remembered his own father, a hard man who had taught him that hate was the same as strength. Was that the legacy he wanted to pass on to Matthew? As the sun disappeared behind the trees, James made a decision. He needed to talk to his son. But first, he needed to understand more. Tomorrow, instead of following Matthew, he would visit the Rainbow Youth Center himself. What he would say when he got there, he had no idea. But for the first time in years, James was willing to listen to something other than the voice of hate that had guided him for so long. He just hoped it wasn't too late to know his son, his real son, not the boy James had tried to force him to be. James sat in his truck outside the Rainbow Youth Center for nearly an hour, his courage failing him each time he reached for the door handle. Finally, he saw a middle-aged woman leaving the building and made his decision. "Excuse me, ma'am," he called out, approaching her carefully. "I was wondering if I could ask you something about this place." The woman studied him with kind but cautious eyes. "I'm Diana, the director here. How can I help you?" James swallowed hard. "My son, I think he comes here. I'm trying to understand why." Diana's expression changed slightly. "We respect our members' privacy. Many aren't ready to share with their families yet." "I just want to know if he's okay," James said, his voice cracking. After a long pause, Diana said, "Why don't you come to our parent meeting next week? It's for parents learning about their LGBTQ children." James nodded, took the flyer she offered, and drove home in silence. That evening, when Matthew came home late again, James was waiting in the living room. Linda had already gone to bed. "Sit down, son," James said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "We need to talk." Matthew froze in the doorway, his backpack clutched to his chest like a shield. "About what?" "About where you've been going. About who you really are." The color drained from Matthew's face. "What do you mean?" James took a deep breath. "I know about the Rainbow Youth Center. I know you've been lying about studying at the library." Matthew dropped his backpack, his hands shaking. "How did you?" "I followed you," James admitted. "I thought maybe you were into drugs or something, but then I saw." He couldn't finish the sentence. "So now what?" Matthew's voice was barely a whisper. "Are you going to kick me out? Beat me up? Isn't that what your clan friends would do?" The words hit James like physical blows. "Is that what you think of me? That I'd hurt my own son?" "What am I supposed to think?" Matthew's voice rose. "My whole life I've heard you talk about how people like me are sick, are going to hell, should be removed from society. Do you know what it's like to hear your own father say those things about you?" James sat stunned. He had never seen his quiet son so passionate, so angry. "Every rally, every meeting, every horrible thing you've said, I've had to pretend it wasn't killing me inside," Matthew continued, tears now streaming down his face. "Do you know how many nights I've thought about just ending it all? Because I could never be what you wanted me to be." The room seemed to spin around James. "Matthew, I never knew." "Of course you didn't know. You never bothered to know me. The real me. You were too busy hating people to notice your own son was one of them." Linda appeared in the doorway, awakened by the shouting. "What on earth is going on?" Matthew looked from his mother to his father, his whole body trembling. "I'm gay, Mom. That's what's going on. And Dad just found out." Linda's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, Matthew." "And now he has to decide," Matthew said, looking directly at James. "His hate or his son. He can't have both." The three of them stood frozen in a moment that seemed to stretch forever. James felt as if he were standing at the edge of a cliff. Behind him was everything familiar: his beliefs, his friends, his identity. Ahead was unknown territory. "I don't want to lose you," James finally said, his voice rough with emotion. "Then you have to lose something else," Matthew replied. "Your hate or me. Choose." James looked at his son, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years. He saw the strength it had taken for Matthew to survive in this house, with a father like him. He saw courage he had never recognized before. "I choose you," James said quietly. "I don't know how to change everything I believed, but I choose you." Matthew stared at his father, disbelief and hope battling on his face. "You mean that?" "I mean it," James said. Then he did something he hadn't done since Matthew was a small child. He opened his arms. After a moment's hesitation, Matthew stepped into his father's embrace, and both men began to cry. The morning after the confrontation, James called his auto shop and told his assistant manager he wouldn't be coming in for a few days. He needed time to think. The house felt different now, as if the walls themselves had changed overnight. Linda moved carefully around James, watching him with worried eyes. Matthew had gone to school, though James had offered to let him stay home. "He needs normal right now," Linda had said. "Something steady." James sat at the kitchen table, turning his coffee mug in circles. "Did you know?" he asked his wife. Linda sat across from him. "I suspected. Mothers notice things, but I was afraid to say anything because of how you might react." Her words stung. His own wife had been afraid of him. "What do we do now?" she asked. James shook his head. "I don't know. I don't know anything anymore." After lunch, James drove to the edge of town and parked near the old barn where the KKK meetings were held. He had the keys. No one would be there today. Inside, he looked at the room with new eyes. The hateful symbols, the robes hanging on hooks, the wooden cross ready for the next burning. For 15 years, this place had been like a second home to him. Now it felt alien, its familiar corners suddenly sinister. His phone rang. It was Earl Stevens, his second in command. "Where were you last night?" "We were supposed to plan the summer rally. Something came up with family," James said. "Well, we decided without you. Big plans, James. We're going to send a real message this time." James felt cold. "What kind of message?" "That Rainbow Center in Clayton County, the one turning our kids gay. Time we shut it down." The Rainbow Youth Center, where Matthew found acceptance, where his son felt safe. "Earl, I don't think that's a good idea." "Not a good idea. It was your idea 3 months ago. What's wrong with you lately?" "Things are complicated right now," James said. "Let's talk next week." He hung up before Earl could argue more. Sitting on a folding chair in the empty barn, James put his head in his hands. The life he had built was on one side. His son was on the other. There was no middle ground. When he got home, he found Linda sitting with Matthew at the kitchen table. They fell silent when he walked in. "Were you talking about me?" James asked. "Yes," Matthew said honestly. "Mom wanted to know more about who I am." James nodded and sat down with them. "I want to know too." For the next hour, Matthew talked about knowing he was different since he was 11, about the fear of disappointing his father, about finding the Rainbow Youth Center online and taking the bus there one day, terrified but desperate for someone to talk to. "They saved my life, Dad," Matthew said quietly. "When I was thinking about ending things, they helped me see I wasn't alone." James felt sick. While he had been preaching hate, his son had been contemplating suicide, because of him, because of what he stood for. That night, James couldn't sleep. He went to the garage and found an old photo album from before he joined the Klan. Pictures of him coaching Matthew's T-ball team, the three of them at the beach. A life before hate took over. Around midnight, his phone buzzed with a text from Earl. "Meeting tomorrow night. Important. Be there." James didn't reply. He knew what the meeting was about. The plans to attack the youth center where his son found refuge. The next morning, he called Diana, the director he had met. "I need to talk to you," he said. "It's urgent." "Is this about our parent meeting?" she asked. "No," James said. "It's about keeping your center safe." After hanging up, he sat on the porch steps, watching the sunrise. The world looked the same as it had yesterday and the day before that, but nothing would ever be the same again. In a few hours, you would tell Diana everything about the clan's plans, about his role as their leader, about his son. In doing so, you would be burning every bridge in his old life. But as the sun rose higher, James Emerson realized he had already made his choice: his son or his hate. And he had chosen his son. Diana's office at the Rainbow Youth Center was small but bright with colorful posters covering the walls. James sat uncomfortably in a chair meant for teenagers, his large frame making it seem tiny. "Let me get this straight," Diana said, leaning forward. "You're not just a member of the KKK, you're their local leader." James nodded, his eyes on the floor. 15 years now. "And you're telling me they're planning something against our center?" "Yes. I don't know exactly what yet, but it won't be just signs and shouting this time." Diana studied him carefully. "Why are you telling me this? Why now?" James finally looked up. "My son, he comes here. He's gay." The word still felt strange in his mouth. "I just found out." Understanding dawned on Diana's face. Matthew Emerson is your son." The shock must have shown on James's face. "He never used his last name here," Diana explained. "Now I understand why." James swallowed hard. "I've done a lot of wrong in my life, said things, believed things, but I can't let them hurt this place. It would destroy my boy." Diana nodded slowly. "I appreciate the warning. I'll contact the police." "That won't be enough," James said. "These men, they won't stop. They'll just change plans." "What do you suggest?" James took a deep breath. "I need to go public. Tell everyone what I've been, what I've done, and what I believe now." 2 days later, James stood on the steps of the county courthouse. A small crowd had gathered, including several reporters from local papers. Linda and Matthew stood to one side, holding hands tightly. James had called the press conference himself, saying only that the leader of the local KKK had an important announcement. No one knew what was coming. He stepped up to the microphones, his hands shaking slightly. For a moment, he feared he would lose his courage. Then he saw Matthew's face, and he began to speak. "My name is James Emerson. For 15 years, I have led the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan in this county." A murmur went through the crowd. "I preached hate against black people, Jewish people, gay people, and anyone else who was different from me." He paused, gripping the podium. "I was wrong. Everything I believed, everything I taught others to believe, was wrong." The crowd grew completely silent. James could see shock on many faces, anger on others. "I'm here today to publicly apologize for the pain I've caused, to renounce the KKK and everything it stands for, and to ask forgiveness from all those I've hurt with my words and actions." A reporter shouted, "Why now? Why the sudden change?" James had prepared for this question. He and Matthew had agreed not to reveal the full personal story. "I've had my eyes open to the damage hate does not just to its targets but to the people who hold it in their hearts. I've seen what blind hatred can cost a person." From the back of the crowd, a voice called out, "Traitor." James recognized Earl Stevens but didn't acknowledge him. "I know many of you won't believe me," James continued. "Words are easy, but I'm committed to making amends through my actions from this day forward. I've already provided information to the authorities about planned KKK activities in this area." The crowd erupted with questions. James held up his hand. "One last thing, to any members of my former group who are listening, it's not too late to change. I did." As he stepped away from the microphones, cameras flashed. James walked directly to Matthew and Linda. His son's eyes were full of tears, but he was smiling. "You did it," Matthew whispered. James put his arm around his son's shoulders. "Let's go home." That night, their house was spray-painted with the word "traitor" in red letters. James cleaned it off before Matthew woke up the next morning. But the truth was out now, and there was no going back. As James made coffee, the morning news played on the small kitchen TV. His face appeared on the screen, along with the headline, "KKK leader renounces hate group in shocking public apology." The journey ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in years, James felt like he could breathe freely. The weight of hate he had carried for so long was finally lifting. The phone rang at 5:30 a.m., jarring James awake. Linda stirred beside him as he fumbled for the receiver. "Emerson," he answered, his voice rough with sleep. "You're dead, race traitor," a muffled voice said before the line went dead. James sat up, suddenly wide awake. It was the third threat this week, and they were getting worse. You didn't tell Linda about this one. She was worried enough already. When you went downstairs, you found Matthew already in the kitchen, staring out the window. "Someone slashed our tires," Matthew said without turning around. All 4 tires on James's truck lay flat in the driveway. James nodded, unsurprised. "I'll call for a tow." James hadn't bothered fighting it. The check that arrived was less than half what the business was worth, but he took it without complaint. At church that Sunday, the pastor had greeted them warmly, but most of the congregation moved to different pews when the Emerson family sat down. People they had known for decades suddenly couldn't look them in the eye. "Aren't you going to report the tires to the police?" Matthew asked, pouring cereal into a bowl. James shook his head. "Sheriff Miller made it clear last time that he's not interested in our domestic disputes, as he called it." The same sheriff who had looked the other way during KKK activities for years was now looking the other way as former members harassed James and his family. Linda came downstairs, looking tired. She hadn't been sleeping well. "I got a call from the grocery store," she said quietly. "They don't need me to work there anymore." James closed his eyes briefly. Linda had worked part-time at Wilson's Grocery for nearly a decade. Now they had lost both incomes. "We'll be okay," he assured her, though he wasn't sure how. Later that morning, James drove Matthew to school in Linda's car. As they approached the high school, Matthew tensed. "I can walk from here," he said when they were still 2 blocks away. James understood. Being seen with his father would only make things harder for Matthew. The son of a race trader already had enough problems. "Matthew," James said as his son reached for the door handle, "I'm sorry for what this is doing to you." Matthew paused. "Don't be. For the first time in my life, I'm proud of my father." The words hit James like a physical blow. He watched Matthew walk toward the school, shoulders straight despite everything. At home, James found Linda sitting at the kitchen table with a pile of bills. "We can last maybe 3 months," she said without looking up. "Then we need to figure something out." James nodded. "I've been applying for jobs. No calls back yet." What he didn't tell her was that he'd already been turned down by 7 places, including 2 where the managers had once called him friend. The doorbell rang. James opened it cautiously, half expecting more trouble. Instead, he found Diana from the Rainbow Youth Center. "May I come in?" she asked. Over coffee, Diana explained that the youth center had received donations from several churches and community groups after word got out about the KKK's planned attack. "We wanted to thank you," she said. "Your warning gave us time to prepare. The police have been patrolling regularly, and we've installed security cameras." "I'm glad," James said. "But I don't deserve thanks for doing the bare minimum of human decency." Diana studied him thoughtfully. "Have you considered speaking to other groups, sharing your story? People want to understand how someone can change so completely." "Who would want to hear from me?" James asked. "More people than you might think," Diana replied. "Change like yours gives people hope." After Diana left, James sat on the porch, thinking about her suggestion. Around him, the neighborhood was quiet. None of the neighbors spoke to them anymore. Their windows stayed shuttered when the Emersons passed by. The loneliness was crushing at times. But when James remembered the fear in Matthew's eyes during all those years of hiding, he knew he would endure much worse to never see that fear again. That evening, as they ate dinner in silence, the sound of breaking glass shattered the quiet. A brick crashed through their living room window, landing on the carpet. Matthew jumped up first, running to look outside while James checked the brick. A note was wrapped around it with a rubber band. "Get out or burn." Linda started crying, her hands shaking as she tried to clean up the glass. "Maybe we should leave," she whispered. "Start over somewhere else." James looked at his wife, then at his son who had returned from checking outside. The choice was simple: stay and fight or run. "No," he said firmly. "This is our home. I won't let them drive us away." The truth was, running wouldn't solve anything. James had helped create this hate. Now he had to face it, not just for Matthew's sake, but for his own. 1 year had passed since James Emerson stood on the courthouse steps and renounced his life as a KKK leader. The seasons had turned, bringing change not just to the trees and flowers, but to the Emerson family as well. James parked his car outside the community center where a special event was taking place. The sign read, Unity in Community, 1-year anniversary celebration. Nervous? Matthew asked from the passenger seat. James nodded. A little. Inside, the hall was filled with people of different races, religions, and backgrounds. Many turned to look as James and Matthew entered. Some faces showed warmth, others caution, and a few still held anger. Diana hurried over to greet them. I'm so glad you came. Both of you. Over the past year, Diana had convinced James to speak at various community events. At first, he spoke only about his regrets and the damage hate causes. But gradually, he began sharing the full story, how discovering his son was gay had forced him to confront his beliefs. With Matthew's permission, father and son had started speaking together at schools and churches about their journey. It hadn't been easy. The Emersons had been forced to sell their home after repeated vandalism. James had struggled to find steady work until a construction company 2 counties overhired him. Linda had started an online business selling handmade quilts. They lived more simply now, in a small apartment, but there was peace in their home that had never existed before. James, a voice called. He turned to see Pastor Green from a local black church approaching. Thank you for coming, James said, extending his hand. The pastor took it firmly. Your testimony at our church last month made an impression. 2 former Klan members have reached out to me since then. James felt a wave of emotion. That's good to hear. Nearby, Matthew was talking with a group of teenagers from the Rainbow Youth Center. His son seemed relaxed, confident, so different from the frightened boy who had hidden his true self for years. A hush fell over the room as Diana stepped up to the microphone. Today we celebrate not just the saving of our youth center, but the power of transformation. 1 year ago, this community was divided by fear and hate. Today, we take another step toward healing. She invited James and Matthew to the stage. Standing side by side, they faced the crowd. Many of you know our story, James began. I was a man filled with hate, leading others down the same dark path. It took almost losing my son to show me how wrong I was. Matthew stepped forward. And I was a kid afraid to be myself, afraid of my own father. Now I stand beside him, no longer hiding. From the back of the room, a voice called out, Why should we trust him? People don't change that much. James wasn't surprised by the question. He heard it often. You're right to be skeptical, he answered honestly. Words are easy. That's why I'm not asking for trust or forgiveness. I'm just trying to undo some of the damage I caused. An older black woman stood up. I've been watching you, Mr. Emerson. For a year, I've seen you show up, speak truth, and take whatever comes your way without complaint. That counts for something with me. Murmurs of agreement spread through parts of the crowd. As James looked out at the faces before him, some friendly, some still wary, he felt a deep sense of peace. The path ahead remained difficult. True reconciliation would take many more years. But for the first time, he could see that path clearly. After the formal program ended, people mingled over refreshments. James noticed Matthew talking with a young man about his age. They stood close, laughing at something. That's Jake, Diana said, following James's gaze. They've been dating for a few months now. I know, James said quietly. Matthew brings him over for dinner sometimes. The first time Matthew had brought Jake home, James had been nervous. Not because Jake was black, though that would have enraged the old James, but because he wanted so badly to make things right for his son. As the evening drew to a close, James and Matthew walked to their car under a sky full of stars. You know, Matthew said, when all this started, I never thought we'd end up here. James put his arm around his son's shoulders. Where did you think we'd end up? I thought I'd lose you, or that you'd lose everything because of me. James stopped walking and turned to face his son. I didn't lose everything, Matthew. I found everything. I found my son, my real son. I found myself again. They drove home in comfortable silence, father and son, no longer divided by hate, but united by truth and love that had survived its greatest test.